Going to dive into a truly fascinating piece of political analysis. We are neutrally unpacking Lawson Akigbe's recent essay, which lays out this incredibly compelling thesis on how 50 years of British political strategy essentially normalized anti-immigrant sentiment. Honestly, whether you follow UK politics closely or you're just curious about how political rhetoric shapes the world we live in, this analysis is an absolute masterclass in tracing the long-term impacts of policy and language.
Akbe actually anchors his entire essay on this powerful zoological proverb: do not feed wild animals, not because generosity is wrong, but because the animal will, in time, consume you. Now, it's an old warning, the kind of thing you'd literally see on a sign at a zoo. But here, it's being used to explain a massive ideological shift in the UK political landscape over the last few decades. It really perfectly sets the stage for a story about unintended consequences and raw political calculation. So let's break down this central metaphor. Akigbe argues that the mainstream political establishment in Britain, across all different parties, has spent half a century feeding a lion, and that lion is anti-immigrant sentiment. Because they kept feeding it rather than confronting it head-on, that lion is now out of its cage. In fact, it's effectively running the show.
Section 1. Feeding the lion. Let's trace exactly how this lion grew from just a quiet murmur back in the late 1960s into the roaring, dominant political force it is today. When you look at the 50-year progression, there are a few key milestones. But what is truly interesting here is that both major political parties, Conservative and Labour, contributed heavily to the feast. It wasn't just a one-sided political maneuver, it was a decades-long bipartisan accommodation.
Section 2. Redefining British birthright.
The first really substantial meal for the lion came during Margaret Thatcher's era, with a major legislative change that fundamentally redefined what it actually meant to hold British citizenship. The 1981 British Nationality Act, which took effect in 1983, completely replaced the ancient common law principle of jus soli, the law of the ground, right, where anyone born on British soil was automatically British. It replaced it with the law of the blood, meaning a child born in the UK to foreign parents was no longer automatically a citizen. This was a massive legislative monument to a growing anti-foreigner sentiment.
Following this ideological shift, successive Conservative governments utilized what the author calls a strategy of conflation. Basically, they seamlessly stitched together the concepts of crime and immigration in public discourse. By using highly repetitive vocabulary, running shared briefings for police and immigration officers, and presenting unified crime and immigration bills, they entrenched this association deep in voters' minds. And the genius of this strategy? It didn't even require evidence, just repetition over and over, until the connection became a neurological default.
Section 3. The bureaucracy of belonging. So what happened when New Labour took power in 1997? Well, they didn't dismantle this architecture. Actually, they built a bureaucratic moat right around it. To illustrate this, the essay points to the introduction of the Life in the UK citizenship test under Home Secretary David Blunkett. Rather than being a genuine tool for integration, this shifted the whole focus of national identity to obscure historical trivia. It became a mechanism to formally separate the acceptably British from those who had to jump through hoops to prove their worth. Let's play along for a quick second. I'm going to ask you a genuine question from that test, one that was designed to measure a person's absolute fitness to belong in Britain. Do you happen to know the approximate height of the London Eye observation wheel in meters? Is it 75, 120, 135, or 200?
The correct answer is 135 meters. But get this, the absurd irony here is that a British Home Office minister, whose very own government designed this test, was asked this exact question in a parliamentary committee, and he couldn't answer it. The source highlights this specific moment to show that the test was never really about measuring British life. It was just bureaucratic theater, meant to symbolically satisfy a constituency that was demanding tougher borders.
Section 4. In Islands of Strangers. Now let's fast forward to May 2025. This is where the rhetoric reached a controversial new peak. While launching a stringent new immigration white paper, Prime Minister Keir Starmer warned that without strict rules, the UK risked becoming an island of strangers. The author draws a direct line from this to Enoch Powell's infamous 1968 speech, which warned that the British risked becoming strangers in their own country. Whether it was a careless speechwriting error or a deliberate strategy, Starmer was dipping into the exact same rhetorical well. In the immediate fallout, a massive political miscalculation. By borrowing this specific vocabulary, Labour alienated its own base, dropping 4 percentage points in support, according to the British election study. And they gained absolutely zero ground with their political opponents.
It was a complete lose-lose scenario that ultimately ended with the prime minister having to express regret.
But the structural irony here is just immense. Under the specific logic of this stranger's rhetoric, the previous Prime Minister Rishi Sunak, a man of Indian heritage born in Southampton, would technically be considered one of those strangers. The essay argues that Sunak's very presence in Downing Street was a living constitutional argument that Britishness isn't a racial category. Yet that argument was inadvertently undermined by that specific phrase.
But hold on, there is an even deeper arithmetic irony regarding the actual origins of those seeking to live in the UK, and it centers on this specific number, 68%.
Research cited in the source shows that nearly 70% of asylum seekers arrive from nations fundamentally shaped, extracted from, and sometimes actively destabilized by British colonial or military actions. Places like Afghanistan, for example. So an island of strangers turns out to have actually invited a huge number of its visitors through its own historical foreign policies.
Section 5. The Lion Leads.
This brings us to Akibe's most damning critique of the progressive political establishment. The greatest intellectual failure over 50 years is that the affirmative moral case for immigration was simply never made. The fact that the National Health Service would literally collapse without foreign workers, never loudly defended. Instead, what was offered were just slightly softer versions of conservative restrictions. And by doing this, they validated the underlying premise that immigration is inherently a problem to be managed. They were effectively feeding the lion smaller cuts of meat instead of starving it.
And because of this constant accommodation, the anti-immigrant lion, now embodied by far-right parties like Reform UK, has fully left its electoral cage. Think about it. Reform UK didn't build this architecture. They just sat down at the feast laid out by Thatcher, Blair, and Starmer. And now, they are confidently setting the parameters and the vocabulary for the entire national debate.
The concluding lesson from the source material is stark and honestly very powerful. Accommodating a hostile premise only guarantees that the premise eventually wins out. You absolutely cannot spend half a century treating an argument as a political reality to be carefully managed and then act surprised when that argument completely takes over. Which leaves us with this final provocative thought based on the analysis. If the political establishment spent 50 years rhetorically appeasing this sentiment, is it too late to undo it? Can a political system ever put the lion back in the cage, or are they destined to be consumed by the very forces they chose to feed? It is a fascinating question and a brilliant framework for understanding modern political strategy. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and remember to always keep questioning the narratives you see on the news.